I'd like to call to order. We'll start off with a roll call. Stacy.
Justin Rock.
Here.
David Glabe.
Here.
Corrine Dudo.
Here.
Nicole Howard.
Here.
Molly King is absent excused. Marianne Meisner.
Here.
Denise Wheeler is absent excused. Lauren Babcock is absent excused. Elena Carollo.
Here.
Ricky Joe Hickey.
Here.
Roxy Ogilvie. Matt Scarfo.
Here. Thank you. This special session has been scheduled for the sole purpose of considering funding approval of applications submitted under the Call for Projects program. There will be no public comments entertained this evening, as this is a joint special session of the Urban Renewal Agency and the Urban Renewal Advisory Commission for the sole purpose of considering funding applications for the Call for Projects. And with that, I will be turning this over to Timothy Bishop.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Yes, sir.
Before we do the staff report, we do need to check to see if anyone has a conflict of interest. So if you or a relative is an applicant for any of these or is related to the primary contractor that has actually bid on the project, then you would need to declare a conflict of interest and you would not be able to participate in the deliberations or the voting. None. And don't forget to put your microphone on. Thanks.
Okay, so we'll take it away. So first of all, thank you all for being here this evening. We have a pretty lengthy agenda tonight. I'm going to move ahead here. We're going to do a quick report, just an overview of all of the 9 projects that we've received. I think we'll do the quick staff report first. We'll do questions from first staff at the end. And then we'll do a quick break, at which time the URAC and the agency can discuss those projects at length. During the break, the agency and URAC will individually have the opportunity to award up to 40 discretionary points for each application and provide staff their scores at the end of the break. When we reconvene, the agency and URAC will review the final scoring results and rankings, followed by a vote on project funding. So up discussion will be before the break, yeah. So we'll do the staff reports and discussion before the break. Okay, so with that, just a quick overview of our timeline. This year's Call for Projects opened up on March 13th. Applications were due by May 26th. So we had about 6 weeks there. We had 9 applications submitted. The applications were reviewed as they came in, deemed complete. As with those were deemed complete, those who had requested a start early authorization were also issued a start that authorization when their applications were deemed complete. Staff then evaluated and scored the applications based on the staff assigned criteria. You were given your packets on June 26th and had an opportunity to submit questions by July 3rd. Those questions have been answered and were sent out to all agency and URAC committee members last week. And you were asked then to submit your preliminary scoring by July 7th. Those have been submitted, and we'll be looking at those this evening as we go on the break to look at our preliminary score before you deliberate and have the opportunity to award up to 40 discretionary additional points to each applicant. So with that, we'll just dive right into the actual applications. So our first applicant was Becky's Burger Barn. This is located at 1702 North Spruce Street. This application, the total project cost was $63,000, $63,246, with a funding request of 623. All of the items in this application were deemed as eligible expenses. So that would make the maximum eligible grant of $31,623. The project included replacing windows. There is some painting and staining of the building. There's a removal of a hazard wind or nuisance tree, some partial roof replacement, and landscaping improvements to that corner lot. The project does meet the key objectives of developing or redeveloping unused and underused properties, while also supporting the expansion of local retail business. For the purpose of this particular, for the purpose of URAC scoring, we would treat a restaurant as a retail business. It's a business that customers come in, buy service. So for that, under that definition, this would be a retail business. The building has been vacant for 3 years, and the project will reduce blight by addressing a combination of both interior and exterior damage that will be repaired or improved as part of the application. One of the questions that isn't highlighted here is the length of time the business has been in business. Becky's Burgers Wagon, the food cart actually started in 2019. She purchased this building in 2022. So that business is 4 years old in this location, less than 1 year. Our second application was Eastern Oregon Wheelworks. For those of you not familiar with this business, the business is an existing business located on Washington that builds custom mountain bike wheels. And they are expanding potentially into this project. This project is located at 711 Adams Avenue. Total project cost is $199,086. The funding request is $75,000, which is also the maximum eligible for this project. This is a renovation and adaptive reuse of the former gas station. Some of you know it as the nut corner. So we've historically had a gentleman out there selling nuts and other items on a seasonal basis, but it's been vacant for a number of years. The project highlights include completely new electrical, plumbing, and HVAC systems, new interior walls, replacing the glass exterior with new tempered glass, and significant site improvements including ADA access, asphalt and sidewalk repair, and new landscaping on this corner. So this is a pretty significant redevelopment that will then house an expanded will then house an expanded local business. Again, this also meets the urban renewal plan criteria of removing blight, but also supports the expansion of existing retail business as well. Moving on, we have the Evermine Labels building. This particular building is located at 1124 Washington Avenue. This project is almost entirely an exterior renovation. This project includes basically removing and reconfiguring the Washington Avenue entrance to the building, replacing the curved driveway that goes up under that porticature with an elevated patio with ADA compliant ramp, and then stairs leading up to that entrance. The building entry will be replaced, and the existing overhang that extends over the driveway will be repaired, repainted, and serve as a cover over the extended patio. This particular project activates the building frontage by creating that outdoor patio, bringing the front of the building forward, flush with the sidewalk, consistent with much of the rest of the downtown, and reconnecting that entrance to the sidewalk. and enhancing the walkability of the block.
Hey, I don't know if you noticed, but page 3 of the application, it looks like they have more words and it's cut off. Can you tell us what the rest of that is? Because it talks about the utilization, including espresso bar or history books, and then there's clearly some missing text. And it goes on to talk about space in the top volume. Can you tell us?
Let me see what's missing in there.
Page 3 of the application.
To the
I think it
application.
shows in the drawing, right?
I don't think so. What's after books? There's cut off letters.
I think it's just and
words.
space on the top for,
Now, there's a T and a C or a T and O. You see what I'm saying? Yeah, there's clearly cut off text there.
Yep.
oh,
It
isn't it
would
the
be
stuff that's on the
nonsensical
bottom?
if
So I just thought it was a comma
it,
there.
no, I think it's compressed text. Can you tell us what was there?
I believe it's actually in that next line item in the lower font. So, space on the top floor, ballroom, stage, and foyer. So the future use of the building will include the espresso bar, which will be adjacent to and on the Washington frontage of the space, and that'll be a bookstore and coffee bar, and then plus the space on the top floor of the Elks building to the left would be a ballroom, stage, and foyer, and continued use as Evermind's label.
There's a letter T and a cut off. What was that?
And I don't know, I can't see.
Okay, bookstore,
That makes sense,
something,
yeah.
space on the top. Okay, do we know if there's other things in there or no?
On this particular section of the building, going back, so the bookstore will be adjacent to where those windows are, just to the left. So the main entrance, the patio, will enter into the main entrance, which is Evermind labels in the back, and the coffee shop and bookstore on that front side. The other uses that are listed here are intended uses for the 3-story portion of the building, which is the later renovation that they'll continue to work on after this project. So the scope of this work really is activating really just this frontage and bringing this out as an entry and reactivating the street frontage of the property.
Okay, so these are just future uses, not what they're.
Correct.
I couldn't see where that fit into this space, which is what brought the question.
Correct. Yeah, and I think your question here in the formatting was really a formatting with the digital application that got submitted. So we'll do some work on future and double check that formatting, make sure that it comes through.
Just have one small comment about that application. I think it's the designer or the architect, someone included examples of other projects they've done.
If you're working through a binder this big, that can be misleading. You're like, that's gonna be pretty, that's cool, and then you take a beat and realize, this is not this project. So maybe, I don't know, maybe leave it out, or I know they're submitting it, but it could give one the sense that this will look very different if one does not read carefully.
That's a good point. So we will attempt to weed out the superfluous information out of future applications.
Well, just like other projects.
Other projects.
Look good. I don't
Exactly.
think
I agree with you, Nicole, but in the same sense, I was like, wow, they did some really nice improvements, and so in that regard, I thought it was somewhat relevant to seeing, yeah, like, they clearly
Demonstrates
care
the
about
vision.
what they've done, and they've done other things,
Yeah,
but I can see it both ways.
I think it's because we've seen it before from them, what they have done. So we know how they do their improvements.
Yeah.
Maybe,
Yeah.
why we don't care, because
We don't have to spend time on it, I just thought.
I've seen it several times.
It must have just been me.
Are there other questions on this particular project, or?
Are they keeping the overhead, the overhang?
Yes, so that will be repainted, repaired, and that will then cover a portion of that extended patio. So you'll have shaded patio seating under there.
So I do have one question here, and I'm trying to find it here. The pedestrian-friendly open space that's gonna attract people to sit, relax, enjoy the cultural and historical appeal of downtown Grande. Is this going to be open to the public? Is that the idea here, is that this is going to be a public space?
Well, it's private property, but the idea is, yes, it's a gathering space with the coffee shop. Folks will be able to go in, grab coffee, sit out on the patio. They'll be able to have, musical performances on there during events like Crazy Days. So it would in fact be a gathering space where you could hold public functions.
The other thing I want to point out, they had a community open house when they first moved their business here. And this vision that they're setting forth for retail, they had that vision way back then. So it's not a vision that is put forth because of the funding for this project. They've got a lot of plans, and this is just another step.
Okay?
And I guess the patio, they have the espresso bar that's going to kind of feed the patio.
Correct.
At first I couldn't figure out, well, why are they doing this? Is this for employee lunches or what? The espresso bars.
I'm wondering the same thing. The history books are not going to be a part of?
It's a coffee shop and bookstore. So, focusing on local history. And we kind of digressed a little bit on the scope of the project there, but yeah, so there is a retail component and a sort of ability to do public functions and casual public use there. Other questions before we move to the next one? We can come back and go into more depth on each of these if you have additional questions. Okay, so this next one, this is actually the Final Cut Pizza and Pub. This is an existing pizza parlor, been around for a little over a decade, I believe. The restaurant sold about a year and a half ago, so relatively new owners. They have gone in, they've been making a number of changes, including, obviously, as you can tell from the slide, changed the name of the business and doing some interior renovation. So this particular funding request is for some of the physical exterior improvements as well as some expansion. The adjacent space has come available, and so there's an opportunity to expand into that space. Total project cost is $150,466. The funding request is $75,000, and that would be the maximum eligible grant for this project. Project includes new siding and paint on the front facade, renovating the outdoor dining patio space in the front, new exterior lighting. They'll also add ADA compliant restrooms and the expansion into the adjacent space, which is currently a hair salon that is relocating. The project then includes some improvements to the parking, doing chip sealing and crack sealing to the front parking lot. Pretty straightforward project. It is outside of downtown, so it doesn't impact the CBZ, Central Business Zone, but it does support the expansion of an existing retail business, so it does meet that requirement in the urban renewal plan. So we'll move forward.
Can't we just
Yes,
one
go
thing?
back, yes.
Have they already purchased the other part of the building?
They are not the owner, they are tenants.
Oh, they're tenants.
So they are expanding, so it will,
Okay.
their space plus the expanded space will be the leased space.
Okay, thank you.
Do we know what their lease arrangement is? Because to me, the permanence of that lease
Yeah.
is relevant here.
The property owner has signed off on the application, and in fact, the property owner is paying for some of the private match for the improvements. So they are a funding partner as well. But I do not have a copy of the lease arrangement.
This is a 2-year or a 5-year or 10-year lease.
I have not seen the lease arrangements, no. Other questions? We'll move on to our next applicant, which is JC Woodworks. This is the building at 415 and 417 Jefferson Street. You can see both addresses there. This building, this project really is a brick repointing, repair, and includes a couple of window installations into some of the shop space for better lighting. The property is located on Jefferson Street. This is a particularly blighted area of downtown. This is mostly a cassette repair and repointing of historic brick. Pretty straightforward project. I'm not sure there's a lot more detail to share. The building is currently fully occupied, supports the woodworking shop, the tile shop, and then the owner does have a private residence in the front brick portion of the building as well.
Are the windows, sorry, are the windows that are in that picture, is that a rendition of what would appear? Or
No, this is actually the front of the building
as it is currently?
as it is currently. In the pictures that are submitted
Right.
by the applicant, you can see some windows that have been bricked up over the years, and the idea is to reopen a couple of those to put light back into the actual the shop workspace.
Is that on the south side then? Is that
East side.
the east side?
So this is the north side of the south side of the space that you're looking at. So the east side over to the right.
I don't think the east side is visible from any roadway, is it?
It is visible from Jefferson Street
if you come down
because of the loading dock.
Okay.
So Timothy, they got a grant once before. Was it for the other part of the building though, wasn't it? For when Sam
So-
opened up the original one?
So they got a grant, I believe, in 2018, I believe. I will have to double check my records. And that was for the expansion that included the expansion into the tile shop.
Okay, thank you.
So, to clarify, this work is for the business or the residents?
This is for the building, so there is brickwork to be repaired on 4 sides of the building.
Okay.
So
They live in the building on the right. and
they
the
live in
north-
the front section of the building on the right. That building then extends back into the actual tile workspace where they do the tile shop, and then is connected to the original business space that was the woodworking shop. So the 3 are all interconnected as one live-work space.
Can you comment on the building's historicity?
I am not familiar with the history of this building beyond the fact that I know it's, I know it, actually, I don't know the history of the building at all.
Does this fall under landmarks?
It is outside of the landmarks, Historic Landmarks Review Commission, because that boundary goes right down the middle of Jefferson Avenue.
So speaking more generally, this is presented in here as being a historic building. Where do we draw the line on what qualifies a building as being of historic value and where it doesn't? I understand how that relates to the Landmarks Commission, but how does it relate in this case to this particular building, and where do we draw that for these projects?
So I think, if I understand the question, I mean, I think I would look at this building as being historic. It's older than 50 years, so that's the traditional definition of building over 50 years old is eligible to be listed as a historic building. This building dates back to, I would say, at least the early 1900s. It may be a little bit older than that. It is consistent with the historic architecture of the rest of Jefferson Street. So I think it does contribute to the character of the existing streetscape, being from the same era. And so the adaptive reuse of that building in its historic context would make sense. Did I answer the question? I'm not sure.
I think so. I'm just looking for what our criteria is, you know, and how that would be, you know, relevant. We don't have points necessarily specifically here that are applied to, you know, historic buildings and that sort of thing, but I'm just, you know, just curious as to where that eligibility criteria is. Okay.
Yeah. So this is a historic building. It is not listed on the National Register, and it is not listed as part of, it's outside of the local historic district.
Sorry, just looking at this picture compared to the one, so for the bid that was submitted for the addition of the 3 windows, that's on the opposite side of the building?
That is on the east side, so to the right of the red brick building. Along that, there's actually there's a driveway and loading bay to the adjacent building, and that's where you can see that building then from Jefferson Street.
Their driveway is horseshoe shaped and they can, because they are unloading slabs of granite for the countertops and things. So.
It's 1920 if anyone cares.
Okay. Are there other questions on this project? Again, we can come back and answer any additional questions. So our next project is the NK West storefront. This is actually just the storefront, the 2 window bays that you see on the bottom right-hand side. This project now has a new owner. The property sold in December of 2021. The new owner is renovating the ground floor retail bay for a retail occupancy. This space is adjacent to the music store and has never been developed fully, so was left vacant when the building was originally developed. So right now, that space is an empty shell. If you go in, it's just the concrete walls. You can see the beams above. So it's completely undeveloped space with the storefront. So the scope of work that's involved is completing the build out of that one remaining space. So that includes the addition of electrical, plumbing, fire suppression system, and HVAC, since none of those exist in the current space. The project value here is $258,792 for that space. Funding request is $75,000. However, because most of that expense would be considered tenant build-out and not be eligible for funding, the maximum eligible fund would be $57,403 because that would include the basic building systems improvements, since those particular improvements would be part of a major renovation, but they would be tenant agnostic. Regardless of who the tenant was, whether the space was retail, restaurant, or office, you would need to have electrical, HVAC, and basic building systems in place to have it leasable space. This next project, Reed and Associates Insurance, this is a renovation of a previously vacant space. Space was vacant for about a year. Reed and Associates is an insurance agency that is relocated to the building. Total project cost is $158,305. Funding request again here was $75,000. However, maximum eligible grant would be $61,791. The discrepancy there has to do with a couple of factors. Number one, this project actually started prior to the actual application. So any of the improvements that were made prior to our receiving an application would not be eligible. And then secondly, a number of the expenses in here were for tenant improvements, interior tenant improvements, and those were not eligible. So eligible project costs for this include the replacement of the freestanding community bank sign that is out on Adams Avenue, resurfacing the parking lot as site improvements are eligible, and then enclosing the existing drive-through. So while tenant improvements, we could not cover cost of renovating and converting that space to office, the exterior improvements of enclosing that space for future development as office would be eligible. And then repainting the building and repairing some minor exterior damage. The project renovates and reuses an existing downtown building to house a new building, or new business. This is a new business to Grande, relocating from Island City, and it reutilizes a space that had been vacant for less than a year. So if there's no questions, we'll move on to the roadway in. Most of you know where this is on Adams Avenue, coming in from Highway 84. Total project cost on this project is $315,553. Funding request is $75,000, and the maximum eligible grant would also be $75,000. This is mostly repair and renovation of the roadway motel. This project was damaged by a fire in 2021, and again, this is another of those projects that had some ineligible costs. The primary fire damage, including the roof repair, was done prior to the application. So those costs were not eligible for consideration in this project, and there are some other ineligible costs as work had started prior to the application. So these eligible costs only include work that was continued once the project had applied, been deemed complete, and issued a start early application. On this particular project, there includes a number of significant elements, including filling in the swimming pool, removing that element of the property to create additional parking, installation of new PTAC, which is the individual room air conditioning units. Those were deemed non-eligible for this particular project because those are individual air conditioning HVAC units per individual guest room, and there really is no other renovation associated to the guest rooms other than new HVAC. So for the purpose of trying to determine eligibility of HVAC, since those were not part of a centralized mechanical system, but rather individual units that could be removed or replaced individually at a later time, those were not included in eligible cost. but replacing out water heaters, attic insulation, electrical that had to be replaced all the way back to the main electrical box, and then increased energy efficiency lighting, as well as painting of the building, were all deemed eligible. This project is outside of the central business zone, but I think has a significant impact on downtown because it is one of the first commercial structures that you see when you're coming in on that first entrance on an entry corridor into downtown. So it did get points for that impact on the central business zone.
Did they get insurance money for the fire?
They did, and the project does cover the amount of that insurance payment is reflected in their investment in this property. They actually were investing in another property at the time of the fire and shortly thereafter, and then that amount of money is also now being reinvested back into the renovation of this project. So Valley Insurance, this is another expansion, renovation of another bank building that was recently vacated downtown. This is the former Umpqua Bank located at 1215 Adams Avenue. This project cost is $372,075. The original funding request was for $75,000. Again, much of this project is interior renovation, and most of it is tenant improvements. So the maximum eligible funding for this project would be $59,000 based on eligible project costs. This is another of those projects where, because it was an expansion of an existing business, the opportunity to purchase the building happened last summer. They bought the building and began renovations in September. So work that was done prior to call for projects was not eligible. So eligible work on this project only includes work that was completed after their call for projects application was received, deemed complete, and ineligible, and they were issued a start early authorization. So included in the eligible cost for this project are the exterior paint, replacement of non-functioning HVAC. Again, this project, while much of the work was interior tenant improvements, that did include replacing a non-functioning HVAC system and new signage once they're done. The rest of this project is really tenant improvements. The tenant will be occupying roughly half of the space, and then there will be 3 additional professional office spaces available for lease, separate from the tenant occupancy. The space was vacant for 11 months from the time that Umpqua vacated the current space until the current tenant bought it and began the renovation process. Are there questions for this one before we? Okay. Yep.
Well, it's a question, and I know I was asking the staff questions, but it was relating to the budget piece in their application, and I was trying to find the page number to actually reference. Page 6, where it shows the breakdown of the source and the amount. And it lists the U.S. bank loan, but there's no dollar amount. But then the third line item it says project cost and the dollar amount. And so it was just, in reading this, reviewing this, it was a little confusing on how, I guess, who, is the project cost, is that assumed to be paid by the applicant? And then, of course, with the blank bank loan line items. I was just curious how that falls. should we know?
Page,
It was page 6 in the application portion of the packet
okay,
for evaluation.
okay, so if we go to page 8, where they do the cost estimate breakdown. So that's where you can see, if you look at item 4, they've got the structural interior, cabinets, drywalls, project cost. So they've got 160,000 in those costs. You see the HVAC listed in there. You go to the next page, you find the exterior paint, the exterior signage estimates. So you'll see those costs broken down on that page 8 of the application.
And so it's assumed that those project costs, those funds are covered by the applicant, or the applicant has those dollars secured?
So in that particular piece, yes, those are covered by the applicant.
Okay.
And that's, they didn't list the dollar amount on the US Bank loan. They list here $120,000 down payment on the building. So that is not included in their project costs. And you'll see that on the staff report that we pulled those numbers out. So we are then looking at the 297 is the project costs.
Timothy, was US Bank. I remember a discussion about when applicants come to you, they present the financial information, but having it formally in a public document that is out there, it's a privacy issue, if I recall.
Right. I mean, the challenge is that we don't want to include in the packet personal identifying financial information, bank accounts and loan amounts.
So if they were to denote the extent in terms of the loan with US Bank, that's private. You may know it.
Correct.
But you're not going to put it out there.
Yeah, and there has been some discussion of that, and it does sound like as we move forward, we may likely remove that from the scoring criteria, while we'll still continue to request that information and be able to verify it in-house. There's a lot of confusion with us being able to see that, report that, but for the agency and the URAC to not be able to know what they're voting on that category.
I put a 0 on all of mine
So,
because.
so we will likely remove that and move those points over into the discretionary scoring allocation for the agency and the URAC.
So, kind of along the same lines, we've requested business plans. We've been told they've submitted business plans,
Yeah.
but I wouldn't call any of what we got a business plan.
I know.
And so, are we to assume that you have the business plans?
You
in
have the
detail and for
business
the same
plans
reasons?
that we received.
Okay.
So-
These are terribly
and-
disappointing as a business plan. But I can see where, I mean, if we're really asking them for a solid business plan to say, is this viable? You're gonna face the same issue. You know, if I'm a business, I don't wanna submit that and have that be in a public document. I want a limited number of eyes that are going to see that. And so that may be a discussion point that we wanna have. Again, not maybe relevant to what we're voting on tonight, but in the larger picture of how we proceed in the future. I could see us asking for a more traditional business plan, but.
We ask for a business plan, we
Okay.
provide a template in the application packet.
Right.
And as you will see, individual applicants provided a variety of, which is one of the reasons why on that particular scoring criteria, you know, you're allowed to give up to 5 points. If it's a good, well-articulated business plan, you can rank it higher. You could rank it 1. I think there are a couple of business plans in here that were much better presented than others.
More well thought.
There are some that just, and part of that challenge is also, what is the purpose of the business plan? I think when that is in the criteria, the expectation, I think, originally was a business was buying and renovating the building. We wanted to know the stability of the business going in and making the renovation. It becomes more challenging when it's a maintenance project like J.C. Woodworks. Do you submit a business plan to repoint? I mean, do you really want to see the business plan for J.C. Woodworks in relation to their repointing a business, the building? Or, yeah.
And yet, the probably largest public criticism of the actions of the Urban Renewal Agency are related to viability of the businesses that we've funded. And so,
I'm going to say I think that's true, but historically, and someone with institutional memory can correct me, it's been about businesses that are new. So for example, when Dainty Jewels went out to the business park, there was some conversation preceding that around like, what are Dainty Jewels and what is this business and is it going to make it? And we're going to put a grocery store in here. Is there a demonstrated statistical need for that? So I feel like that was the context in which those business plans were attached. And if a business has been in for 5 years or 10 years or 15 years and they want to expand, I really don't need to see their business plan because they clearly know what they're doing.
that's a good point.
So I think it's sort of apples and oranges. And I don't know, I don't use it much.
And I think it's really challenging sometimes when we're trying to put a business plan and it's the property owner and the property is separate from the business. And so I think that has been confusing in the past. That may be something that at a future work session, we may look at how we present that in the application or present it for scoring. But in the meantime, you are correct. In this year's applications, you have business plans that really do run a pretty full gamut of professionalism and presentation.
I think one of the things that is lacking for this particular section of the scoring, for lack of a better term, is a calibration of the URAC and the agency. Because what's an acceptable business plan to Mary Ann may be very different than what it would be to Matt, or what it would be to
The bank.
anyone else. So I think that kind of revisiting that entire section to say, you know, are some of these things so subjective that we just should take them out of that category and reallocate those points to the discretionary piece? Because one of the things that we've tried to do, and I think we've done a really good job with the staff scored items, is it's a go, no go, yes or no, is it or isn't it? And for those things that are the is it or isn't it, and there's a spectrum where you can rate them, that's pretty easy to do. For those that are more subjective and squishy, maybe we just talk about these are some factors you may consider when awarding your X number of discretionary points. And I'll just springboard off of that really quickly. So on your 40 discretionary points that you have your sheet to fill out, it's 40 points for, up to 40 points for each project. And you can award 0, you can award 40, you can award 27.5. Actually, I had someone that had .5s on some of their scoring they submitted earlier. It was not Mary Ann.
Thank you, I did not do that. I always have, but I did not do it this year.
I was shocked and amazed that you did not, and that someone else did. So.
You're welcome, Mary Ann.
I'd like to back up, Timothy, before we move forward. We had this discussion on the phone about Reed and Associates, okay? And granted, they aren't applying for the $75,000, but part of that is the enclosure of the drive-through. So your contention was that it was considered a remodel, correct?
It would be considered a remodel.
And yet, when I look at our policy and when I Google and look at real estate terms, A renovation refers to restoring something to its previous state. It has never been enclosed and never was part of a business. Okay. Remodel refers to creating something new. So it's not a renovation, it's a remodel. Now, the only reason I'm bringing this up is when you look at staff scoring, it scores really high by the staff. But I'm still not convinced that allowing them to enclose basically a carport and enlarge the footprint of the building is something that urban renewal covers. And then when I look back at the policy, see if I've got that. Or I can get my finger on it. Here we go. The primary goal is improving exterior of historic buildings, providing new opportunities for location for a high-traffic retail business, which could include the following: improving accessibility, streetscape projects, and building renovations, not remodels. So I'm just putting that out there for everyone's consideration, because the footprint of the building is where the business was. The rest is a carport they want to enclose. And when I look at it that way, you know, I just, with the ranking that it was given, I'm going, So, putting that out there for your consideration.
I'm not sure I have an answer to that question.
More statement than it was a question.
Okay.
Would filling in a swimming pool and turning it into a parking lot fall under the same guidelines you're proposing?
A swimming pool would be made into a parking lot, not a structure, in my mind. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I kind of wondered about that one too.
So that's where the discretionary points come in.
Yeah, I think that when we allow new construction as a specific item, which the policy does, I think it's a little bit of, I won't say splitting hairs because that would be mean of me. I don't think that a strict interpretation to say that enclosing a space and repurposing it into commercial or retail would not be an allowable use.
You know, I just looked back on the policy to see what
Yeah.
was allowed. And maybe that's something we need to address, because that's a real specific change to a building footprint. And it'd be nice to have that guideline in the future.
Yeah, and I think there's also a question, just from a planning and building standpoint. I mean, if you look at that building, it was a bank, that was a drive-through window, so that porticature was in fact an active part of the business. It was a vehicular piece of the business. If you look at the roof, it is all one roof. So I'm not sure, from a planning or building department perspective, whether that's.
It's kind of it's a conundrum.
It's a conundrum, and I mean, from a staff perspective, my interpretation was it's part of the building. It's got a foundation, it's got supporting structures, it's got a roof over it. It is part of the same roof. So from a staff perspective, it's part of the same building, and renovating it to enclose it. You know, very similar to, you know, even what the local did when they took the parking lot, service bay, and converted that and turned that into a patio.
The one in the alley. Is that what you're talking about?
The gas pumps.
The gas pumps.
The gas pumps are now where you get your ice cream.
Oh, the local. I was thinking Side A. Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's room for a discussion, but I think for the purpose of this project, I think it meets the criteria for new construction and continued redevelopment.
Yeah.
So at this point, is there any other agency or URAC discussion on the projects? I know we had a lot of them, 9 projects total. We kind of ran through pretty quickly. We stopped and answered some questions along the way. Are there other thoughts, discussion among the agency or URAC that we can?
I'd like to share that when I was looking up the NK West retail tenant, Marmalade Fresh, they have stores in 4 very large tourist areas. La Grande is not a high tourism area. And the clothing that they want to sell goes for $400 an item. And I just don't see how that's viable in La Grande, Oregon.
Gucci handbags priced
Oh,
at
that's what
five
you were looking at.
something.
Yeah, and so I was a little concerned that that's who they chose as their tenant if they want to be open for another 5 years. And that's just putting that out there for
I'm just
agencies.
confused
Isn't
if
the-
it was real estate or boutique, because I saw it in two different things in 2 different.
They have a retailer to move in, a tenant to move in, and that is their tenant. It's like they are friends with them in Coeur d'Alene and want to put them in here is what it feels like is
They
going
are
on.
married to them.
Okay, so I just don't see how viable it would be in La Grande.
Jim Crow, still there,
Okay,
their $800 Gilson shirts, so stranger things have happened.
all right.
I wondered the same thing, the fit of that particular tenant in La Grande, but then I also felt that the scope of this is not, we're not here trying to dictate what they
That's
bring
true.
or not.
Right,
And so
that's how
I think that's the other side of that, is we're looking at the building and the renovation and that, and maybe not in this particular case necessarily that the tenant that's going to be occupying that space. That was just my,
So then where does the 5-year mark fall into place there? As long as the owner still owns the building, then that project counts,
It's the
not the
real-
retailer.
Is it
It's
the
the
owner who
retail
owns it, or is
property.
it the fact that the building and the business has been there?
So, a couple of points. One, what you're talking about, the one I like to point to is the Tropical Swirls building,
Yes.
which was a highly blighted building, and it had probably 4 or 5 businesses in it. The increase in the property value from the investment that Urban Renewal helped make in that is bringing more value into the district. And so whether they can or can't make Product Day work in the space, creating a highly visible, high-traffic retail business in a spot that's been vacant for all this time is, in my view, a good use of Urban Renewal dollars. If the building sells, that's where we get into that 5-year piece. We have a situation with that building, since you brought it up, where the building has changed hands, but you have Music Source that's in there. I think that, and I think Music Source went in there more than 5 years ago. But But even if it had not, I think that would be a case where we take a look at it and say, even though the building sold, the business that's in there did not change hands. So that may be something that we want to tweak in our next policy thing, just to clarify that, where you have these buildings that have multiple tenants that could be long-term tenants that receive funding. Our intent with the requiring that repayment within that 5-year window is to prevent people from flipping stuff. The intent is we want businesses and activity as part of that. And we don't want to just allow somebody to fix something up and then sell it. Because I think that's one of the things we do, is we want to see the economic activity. Long answer to or comment to the short deal.
That's how I looked at it too, is the business that's already in there. I mean, just
Yeah.
like I looked at Becky's Burgers and said, yes, she's been here for 5 years. And maybe not in that location, but her business is solid. She knows what she's doing.
I didn't see
And
that
wife
as
is-
5
I have a quick question on the.
Four.
My wife won't go by.
Wes, I was just reading the additional information from, I think the application and Mike's notes about the condition, or the windows needing to be replaced, or the tintingness of that. Was that
Yes.
included in the proposal? Or
That
will
was
be
not
additional?
included in the proposal, but that would, if the project is funded, or if he proceeds without the funding. Current code requires that those windows would have to come up to current standard as part of the renovation. So 10% of total project cost would have to come to code compliance standards. And when Music Source was was funded through URAC. The landmarks design standards did not require transparent windows. So that's why you see those opaque windows on that storefront. That landmarks standards have changed, so new construction there would have to meet the new standards. So that is a new piece of the process this year that we've started working on with our applicants. Is when we do our staff review, we also run these applications through planning and building to identify any key code compliance or permitting requirements, so that when we do the agreement, we can identify and clarify those with the applicant at the time of funding, so there's no surprises during the project.
Do we get any sense, based on the current scoring that we have available, of where the funding line would be drawn in the absence of the
I do.
discretionary funds? Okay. Are we privy to that information?
No, because you have 40 points that could swing it. I will tell you that based on just the simple math, you probably have 3 or 4 projects that are very highly likely to be fully funded. I think that there are probably a total of 6, possibly 7 projects that we can reach with the funding. And I'm glad you asked that, Dave. So you've got your sheet with the little blue bars on it where you assign those 40 points. During the break, you'll put those scores in and give them to me, and then I'll plug them in, and then I will stick them up there. If you want to see where the staff scoring and the other scoring that's already been submitted prior to doing that discretionary, I would be happy to put that up there for you. But I don't know that really gains a lot. But if the intent is to, well, I want to make sure that one gets funded, so I would give 0 to all the other ones and 40 there. Yeah, you certainly can do that. I know at least one member of the agency has expressed concern in the past about, there's really not as much of a mechanism to try to make sure that the projects that I think are most deserving get funded. That's where that 40 point comes in, and I think where it has the most influence is probably on those bubble projects, where you have those, because there's some, because of where they are and how much they're investing and that sort of thing, clearly have a going in point advantage. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, I think you did. Just maybe as a tag onto that, again, I think we've got a lot of worthy projects here, and so, but part of what I'm trying to balance is, the dollars we have, how far can we make those go? And I didn't list these out by amount of investment, and I guess that's some of what I'm looking for, is a sense of how far can we carry this? How many can we fund? And is one of the things we haven't talked about here that I do think is a relevant point when we're looking at a limited pie. We only got so many pieces we can cut out of this. Is we do have comments in here on what the applicants perceive happening if they are not funded.
Right.
Would they go ahead with those projects? Would they not? So, just something to bring up.
Yeah, and the way the policy is currently structured, it precludes doing that, stretch the money out to give less to projects. And that's been a pretty contentious topic in the past. And so it's a deliberate by design mechanism. So.
Sorry, I have one more clarification question, and then maybe a comment. But my question, Timothy, when you mentioned the Eastern Wheel Works and it being an old gas station, do you know if the brownfield assessment has been done, or will that need to be done?
No, that project has already had
Okay.
brownfield assessment and remediation and EPA site. So there is no contamination no further contamination to be remediated.
And then I just wanted to comment, I was sad to see that the roadway is going to fill in the pool. I think pools are a great value add, and we don't have a lot of hotels with pools, so just wanted to make that comment. I'm sure it's very expensive to totally
I
overhaul.
don't know if I want to swim in a pool next to like Adam's.
It's nice, it's nice defense, you know, some bistro lights up there.
Okay, are there any other questions from agency or URAC? Why don't we turn it over to the mayor and he can adjourn us to a short break?
What do you think? 5, 10 minutes?
Probably 10, because I've got to plug him in and do some math.
Hey, Tim, I say this every year, are we still on?
Yeah.
I say this every year, just a reminder, this is taxpayer dollars. And I always look on the return on investment. Robert brought it up about property tax values going up with these projects. And everything I look at also is the private investment these people are making into our community. So those are my usually top 2 things I look at first, and then all the flowers and paint and other things.
Well, and we have those numbers in front of us, the
Yeah, I just wanted
public-private
to-
investment and.
Very good point.
And one thing about the roadway is the TRT tax that we have not been getting since it's been closed, so that is an added benefit.
So at this time, if you want to go through and score your sheets, we will come back in 10 minutes after our break and reconvene. All right, folks, we're going to come back to it. At this time, I would invite staff to present the scoring results.
Okay, before I turn the TV back on, so the way the policy is structured, the intent is to fully fund the top-ranked project and continue to go until the dollars are exhausted. I don't think we've had this close. We have 2 of these that there's a 1-point difference, and that 1 point ended up resulting in one of them getting the last few dollars.
Ooh.
So. Hopefully the right thing will come up on the screen. Magic? Okay. As soon as the TV unveils the bottom half.
Oh.
So if you look at the second to the last column with the dollar amounts, so Reed and Associates was by 1 point the last project to receive any funding under the way that the policy is outlined.
Number 6.
Mm-hmm.
Becky's Burgers and final cut.
You can check by allocation, but the just highlighted is the total scores.
So does someone move to approve it?
What's that?
Does someone move to approve?
We will.
You
Yeah, he's got a whole,
got a whole thing?
there's
Or
a
just
whole,
let everybody look it over.
there's a whole agency action form thing.
I mean, the way it's set up, I like this because it's fairly objective. We have a little subjective sprinkling that we added, but I appreciate that our priorities are central business zone, and so I think this reflects where our priorities have been with the scoring, so.
Considering what it was 8 years ago,
Yes,
this
yeah,
process is way better.
it is way
I
better.
mean, it's more fair to the applicants. You know,
Don't you miss
wasn't
the
what we
yelling
were going
just
to
a little
argue
bit?
over and what we were going to do. It's very to the point, you know, I mean, goes by the dollars that they are investing. I mean, it's very fair to the applicants, and I think it's great.
Very objective.
Yeah.
I like making it more objective.
Yeah, we used to just like throw stuff at the wall and see if it stuck.
Whether they're meeting criteria that we set.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think bears pointing out is if you look at the overall points allocated, just that one column, and you look at the bubble projects, the one that ended up getting that, $8,000 was the one that, it was the overall score that put them in that spot.
Not the
'Cause the 20
discretionary?
That overall is the discretionary number.
Okay.
It's the overall assessment discretionary points. So
I see.
your overall assessment of that project, it got an average of 23 as opposed to Final Cut, which got 19. And that difference in those resulted in one of them getting a little bit of money. So I think that does provide a little bit of a validation in terms of how the funding went versus how those discretionary points were assigned for the overall assessment.
Robert, I'm wanting to sum in my head the staff scores, which, clearly were the most objective. Like, if we exclude the 40 points, how did these rankings compare?
If you exclude the 40 points,
No.
Well, if you exclude the subjective components here.
sure.
It's pretty close.
I just did the math, you wanna know.
I do, yeah.
I had 'em
Okay,
right.
Valley Insurance would be 1, Roadway would be 2, NK West and Eastern Wheel Works would be tied for 3, and Evermine would be 4.
Yeah, that's correct. You're
So-
correct.
So we pretty much, you could basically look at the staff scores and say, we knew who was going to be.
Who had the strongest,
What's
yeah,
that?
who had the strongest
yeah.
applications, yeah, based on the criteria.
And we did have an iteration of the process that was, I think, wasn't almost fully rubric-based, and the agency wanted a little bit of interpretive space, and I think that's reflected in a good way. But we can't wildly turn the ship,
Like we've done before.
Yeah, it's been amazing what
Yeah,
happens.
but I like that. I like
I
that
do
it's
too.
mostly objective.
Right.
And then you've got a little bit to maybe
Yeah.
alter a place or two.
Well, I think we need to look at, because the staff scores and the way we scored and picked up on things, there were a couple of things I didn't pick up on. And I feel like staff scores are validated by what we have done, because the scoring, I scored the staff, so I knew how it ranked, and we're right there. So it's a validation from two different sources with collective
See,
minds.
when I read mine, I never even looked at the staff scores. I wanted to see what my scores were. I wanted to see how I felt.
I see.
And then the staff scores were not gonna change, so my scores were what I felt.
Yeah, I did that after.
Not me, I get
as well.
totally swayed by the staff score, and then I do mine.
You are swayed?
Yeah, 100%.
I didn't.
Just kidding.
I don't want to see the staff scores.
Nicole, you're just a pot stirrer.
Just out of curiosity, how many more buildings do we have that we could be putting upper floor residential space into? Because that's a big,
There's probably quite a few.
okay, because that's just a big number.
We have quite a
15 points
few.
that they can get. Yeah.
And I mean, I think
Yeah, quite a few.
if you're thinking just downtown
Uh-huh.
in the central business zone, that's a more finite number.
Right.
But if you think about the idea of doing mixed use with upper floor housing elsewhere in the urban renewal area, there's a huge amount of capacity still.
Okay, I was just curious because there's not a single one that did it this time around. Last year, I think we had 2 or 3.
So we did have a couple of potential projects that were looking at some housing components. They did not submit applications this year, and we are pursuing some other opportunities with them as well.
Okay.
I think this one was a lot better than last year's. We have a lot more applicants. I mean, we have a lot more
Yeah.
choices, which is a
And-
great thing. That means that people are actually trying to upgrade their buildings and do things so I mean, that's a positive note to look at. And of course, we are I'm supposed to invite everybody to have the discussion, but we're already there, so. With that, is there anybody else has any more comments before we move on to the motion?
I think we did a really nice job working on the call guidelines and policies, because it was a lot easier this time around to really understand. And if we wanted to do that every year, I'd be happy to look at policy just to make sure it's even better every year.
And I agree, you know, it's not about making it easier, it's making it more fair to the applicants
Yeah.
and to the citizens, and that's what, I think we've done a really good job, and I appreciate everybody's work on it.
I don't want to staff or involved in this, Timothy, but I think we owe, a big thank you
There you
to
go.
the
Big time,
staff
yes.
that put this together and compiled it, and communicated with the applicants, because I'm sure there's hours and hours of work that is invisible to us in this 300-page packet. And then I would hope that there's some way of reaching out to the applicants who weren't funded and encouraging them to maybe, reconsider things if they can't move ahead on their own. In other years, these are all worthy projects, in my opinion.
Timothy, I want to thank you for addressing phone call questions and then also for emailing questions or things that other people had submitted out. I really value your expertise, and I appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, and I would just say as staff, I mean, we had a pretty good team working on this. I know that, like I said, all of our applications, we met with the applicants, worked through a lot of the questions to help get the best application we could from each of them. But really working ahead of time this year, as I mentioned earlier, making sure that the application got reviewed from a planning perspective, from a building perspective. So I think there was a lot of staff engagement. The thing I'm excited about is this particular year, when I look at the call for projects, I see some good physical sort of building projects, but I also see a lot of business expansion, business growth tied to these projects. So I think sometimes when we think about urban renewal, we think about bricks and mortar kind of investment, but I was really excited to see some genuine business expansion, business growth connected to these projects this year as well. So, and then I just want to thank you all for taking the time over and around the 4th of July weekend and holiday to go through 300 pages of homework. So thank you.
And with that, I'd like to entertain a motion.
I move that we approve the funding, but how does it go?
There's
Do you have
action.
wording?
There's an agency action form in your book that has a
Great,
suggested motion.
thank you. Where do I
Under
find
the
that?
AAF tab.
Ah, thank you. You can have it. I move approval of funding for the call for projects in the amounts as discussed.
A second.
We have a motion and second. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Perfect. Appreciate it. Yes, sir.
So I'll be sending out an email, but start thinking about, are there any tweaks to the policy? I do this after every iteration while it's fresh in everybody's mind. So if there's something you think, hey, we ought to revisit this little piece, you don't necessarily have to wait for me to send that email that I will be emailing out. Just email it back to me with, here's a thought that I have. And then we will typically, a URAC meeting, kind of talk about those and see what the URAC thinks about that and kind of move forward in that general direction. Then the agency will ultimately make a final decision. So that's all I have.
Perfect. Well, I'd just like to thank everybody for coming, and it was a great meeting. We are adjourned.